The rain poured hard outside the shelter, the sound of water hitting the metal roof echoing through the empty halls. Inside one of the cages, a large German shepherd sat motionless, his dark eyes staring blankly at the wall. His fur was matted, his body covered in old scars, some from battles, others from neglect. The tag on his kennel simply read, "Max, no history." Volunteers walked past him every day, but nobody stopped. Nobody knew his story. Nobody knew that this dog had once been a hero. Then, one evening, the door creaked open and footsteps approached. A man in his late 30s, wearing an old military jacket, paused in front of Max's cage. His breath caught in his throat. "No way," he whispered, his voice shaking. Max's ears twitched. That voice, he knew that voice. Slowly, he turned his head, his tired eyes locked onto the man's face. A low whine escaped Max's throat. The man dropped to his knees. "Max, it's really you." But as he reached out, Max flinched, not in fear, but in something deeper, something broken. The man's hands trembled. "You don't remember me, do you?" Silence. Then Max lowered his head, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 battles. The man's eyes burned. "I won't leave you again." But the question hung in the air. Why had he left in the first place? The shelter lights flickered as the man, Captain Daniel Reynolds, stayed crouched in front of Max's cage, his mind racing. 5 years. 5 years since he last saw this dog, his partner, his brother in every fight. The military had told him Max hadn't survived the explosion that nearly took Daniel's leg. They said the dog was gone, a hero's death. But here he was, alive, yet so different. The Max he knew had been fearless, always alert, always ready. This dog was a shadow of that spirit. His body tense, his gaze hollow, like he had given up long ago. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, chewed-up rubber ball, the same one Max used to carry around during their patrols. He rolled it slowly toward the cage. Max's nose twitched. A faint spark lit in his eyes as he stared at the toy, but he didn't move. Daniel's chest tightened. "You remember this, don't you? You used to drive me crazy, dropping it at my feet at 3 a.m. He forced a laugh, but his voice cracked. A shelter worker walked over, curious. "You know this dog?" Daniel didn't take his eyes off Max. "Yeah, we served together. He saved my life more times than I can count." The worker hesitated. "He was brought in as a stray, no chip, no records. He's been here 6 months, nobody wants him. He's aggressive with other dogs, doesn't trust people." Daniel clenched his jaw. Aggressive? Max had been the most disciplined canine in their unit. Something had happened to him. Something bad. "I'm taking him home," he said firmly. The worker sighed. "Look, I get it, but he's not the same. We had to sedate him twice because he tried to—" "I don't care," Daniel cut in. "He's mine." Just then, Max let out a low growl, not at Daniel, but at something behind him. Daniel turned. A tall man in a black coat stood near the exit, watching them. The stranger's cold stare locked onto Max before he turned and walked out. Daniel frowned. Who was that? The worker shrugged. No idea, never seen him before. Max's growl turned into a whimper. His body trembled, his ears pinned back. Daniel had seen that look before, in war zones. It was fear. Something was very wrong. The paperwork took hours, but Daniel refused to leave without Max. As he signed the last form, his hands shook, not from exhaustion, but from the gnawing dread that had settled in his gut since seeing that stranger in the shelter. Who was he? Why had Max reacted that way? The worker had mentioned Max being brought in as a stray, but something didn't add up. Military dogs didn't just disappear and turn up on the streets. They were tracked, retired with honor, unless someone didn't want Max to be found. Daniel loaded Max into his truck, the dog's body stiff with tension. He didn't resist, but he didn't relax either, his eyes darting to every shadow. Daniel kept his voice soft as he fastened the seatbelt around Max's harness. "You're safe now, buddy. Just you and me." Max didn't respond, but his tail gave the faintest twitch, almost like he wanted to believe it. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional whine from Max when a loud truck passed too close. Daniel's mind raced. He needed to get Max to a vet, check for microchips the shelter might have missed, but first, he had to get him somewhere secure. His house was isolated, surrounded by woods, good for privacy, bad for escape attempts. He glanced at Max. The dog was staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass. "You remember the cabin, don't you?" Daniel murmured. "That time we got snowed in for 3 days? You ate all my beef jerky." A ghost of a memory flickered in Max's eyes, but it vanished just as fast. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Max's ears pricked up. The cabin was just as Daniel had left it, weathered but sturdy, the porch light casting a warm glow over the front steps. He opened the truck door, but Max didn't move. "Come on, boy," Daniel coaxed, patting his thigh. "Home?" Max hesitated, then slowly hopped down, his muscles coiled like he expected an ambush. Inside, Daniel had set up an old dog bed near the fireplace, the same one Max had used years ago. He'd kept it, even when everyone told him to move on. Max sniffed it, then circled twice before lying down with a heavy sigh. Daniel crouched beside him, running a hand over his fur. "We'll figure this out," he promised. "Whatever happened, I'm not losing you again." Then his phone buzzed. An unknown number. The message was a single line. "You shouldn't have taken the dog." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned to Max. The dog was staring at the door, a low growl building in his throat. Outside, a twig snapped. Someone was there. Daniel's hand froze midair as Max's growl deepened into a snarl, the kind that used to send insurgents scrambling for cover back in their combat days. Every muscle in the dog's body was rigid, his focus laser-sharp on the front door, where the faintest shadow moved across the frosted glass pane. The message on Daniel's phone burned in his mind. You shouldn't have taken the dog, but there was no time to process it. Instinct took over. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the hunting knife from his boot and clicked off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the dying embers in the fireplace. Max immediately fell silent, but his ears remained pricked forward, his training overriding whatever trauma had broken him. The floorboards outside creaked under deliberate weight. Not an animal. Someone who knew how to move quietly, but couldn't mask their presence completely. Daniel's pulse hammered in his throat as he positioned himself beside the doorframe, knife ready. Max slunk to his side without command, his ragged breathing steady now, focused. For the first time since the shelter, Daniel saw a flicker of the old Max, the partner who'd once taken down an armed assailant in pitch-black darkness by sound alone. A gloved hand appeared at the edge of the window, peeling back the curtain just enough to peer inside. Daniel held his breath. Then, bang. The front door shuddered as a boot kicked it open, the knob smashing into the wall. A figure clad in black tactical gear lunged inside, a pistol sweeping the room. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the intruder's wrist and slammed it upward as the gun went off, the bullet embedding in the ceiling. Plaster rained down as they grappled, but before Daniel could land a disabling strike, Max moved. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl. He struck like a shadow, sinking his teeth into the intruder's thigh with brutal precision. The man screamed, his free hand clawing at the holster on his hip. Daniel wrenched the primary gun away and drove his knee into the attacker's stomach, sending him crashing onto the coffee table. Wood splintered. The pistol skidded across the floor. Max released his grip, but stayed poised over the man, lips curled back, saliva dripping from his fangs. Daniel flipped the intruder onto his stomach and yanked off the balaclava. A stranger, early 40s, military short hair, a jagged scar running from his eyebrow to his jawline. No identification. "Who sent you?" Daniel ground out, pressing the knife to the man's throat. The intruder coughed, blood speckling his lips, but his eyes darted to Max with something like recognition. Then, "Delta 9, they'll burn you for this." A code phrase. Daniel's stomach dropped. Delta 9 was a black ops unit disbanded after rumors of war crimes. Max had been part of their K9 division before transferring to Daniel's team. If they were involved... A metallic click cut through the silence. Daniel barely had time to register the second attacker in the hallway before Max leaped, knocking him sideways as another gunshot exploded. Pain seared through Daniel's shoulder. A graze, but it burned like hell. Max hit the second intruder chest first, his weight carrying them both through the flimsy drywall. The man's head snapped back against the exposed studs with a sickening crack. A silence. Daniel scrambled up, his injured arm screaming in protest, just as headlights flooded the living room through the shattered front door. A black SUV idled in the driveway, its passenger window rolling down to reveal a familiar face, the same cold-eyed stranger from the shelter. The man didn't speak, just raised a detonator in his gloved hand and pressed the button. The explosion came from the back of the house. The blast sent Daniel flying forward, his body slamming into the overturned coffee table as a fireball erupted from the kitchen. Shrapnel and splintered wood tore through the air, the concussion wave leaving his ears ringing. Smoke billowed in thick, choking clouds, stinging his eyes as he tried to push himself up. His vision swam. Flames licked up the walls, devouring the curtains, the heat already unbearable. Through the haze, he saw Max struggling to stand near the collapsed drywall, his fur singed, one paw held awkwardly off the ground. The second intruder lay motionless, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. Daniel coughed, tasting blood. "Max, here!" he croaked, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the fire. The SUV outside revved its engine, tires spitting gravel as it peeled away. They weren't sticking around to confirm the kill. Professional. Max limped toward him, his body trembling with effort. Daniel grabbed his collar and hauled himself upright, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. The front door was blocked by collapsed beams, flames dancing hungrily across the ceiling. Only one way out, the bedroom window at the back, if the explosion hadn't compromised it. They stumbled down the hallway, the floorboards scorching underfoot. Daniel's lungs burned with every breath. The bedroom door was ajar, smoke curling through the gap. He kicked it open. The window was intact, but the fire was spreading fast along the baseboards. He yanked the dresser in front of it, giving Max a boost. "Go!" Max hesitated, his eyes darting between Daniel and the window. "Damn it! Max, now!" The dog jumped, his body crashing through the glass just as the ceiling above them groaned. Daniel didn't have time to react. A support beam gave way, slamming down on his leg. White-hot pain shot up his thigh, pinning him to the floor. He clawed at the debris, but it was too heavy. The heat was unbearable now, the air superheated, his skin blistering. This is it. Then, a snarl. Max lunged back through the broken window, his paws bleeding from the glass. He clamped his jaws onto Daniel's jacket and pulled, his muscles straining. The beam shifted slightly, just enough for Daniel to wrench his leg free. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed Max's scruff and half fell, half dragged them both out the window as the roof caved in behind them. They landed in a heap on the wet grass, the cold rain a shock against Daniel's burned skin. Sirens wailed in the distance. Neighbors must have called 911. But Daniel knew better than to wait. Whoever had sent those men would check for bodies. He forced himself onto his knees. Max was panting heavily, his flank streaked with blood and soot, but his eyes were clear, alert, present. Daniel gripped his fur. "They tried to kill us both," he rasped, "which means you know something, and I'm gonna find out what." A glint in the grass caught his eye. The first intruder's pistol, knocked free during the struggle. Daniel grabbed it, checking the magazine. Still loaded. Somewhere in the trees, a twig snapped. Max's head whipped around, a growl building in his throat. They weren't alone. The relentless downpour transformed the forest floor into a treacherous quagmire, each raindrop hammering against the scorched remains of Daniel's cabin like gunfire. Pressed against the smoldering wreckage, Daniel fought to steady his breathing, despite the white-hot agony radiating from his cracked ribs with every inhale. His fingers, raw and blistered from the explosion, clutched the stolen pistol with desperate determination, the cold metal the only anchor in this waking nightmare. Beside him, Max stood like a battle-worn statue, his once glossy coat now matted with soot and blood, every muscle coiled tight beneath scarred skin. The dog's nostrils flared as he scented the air, his ears swiveling with predatory precision toward the tree line where danger lurked just beyond sight. That faint rustle in the undergrowth wasn't the wind. Daniel's combat-honed instincts screamed warnings through the haze of pain. This wasn't some random looter or curious bystander. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, circling them like wolves sizing up wounded prey. He could almost feel the crosshairs hovering over his back. The approaching sirens provided no comfort. If anything, they created the perfect cover for a professional kill. His mind raced through possibilities. Were they waiting to confirm his death? Or had they been ordered to retrieve something? Max's sudden tension answered that question. The shadow emerged like a specter from the rain-slicked pines, clad in head-to-toe tactical black, moving with the eerie grace of special forces. Recognition flashed through Daniel. The posture, the gear, the way the man's gloved hand hovered near a holstered sidearm. Delta 9's signature operational style. Time seemed to slow as Daniel raised the pistol, his injured arm trembling, but Max moved faster than thought. What happened next unfolded in brutal, beautiful synchrony, a dance they'd perfected through countless firefights. Max became a living weapon, his powerful body cutting through the rain without a sound until the last possible second. The sickening crunch of teeth meeting bone echoed as the attacker's suppressed pistol thudded into the mud. Daniel was already moving, his injured leg nearly buckling as he tackled the man into the quagmire. They rolled through the muck, Daniel's burned hands slipping on tactical webbing until a crushing blow to his jaw sent stars across his vision. Then Max struck again, this time going for the kill zone at the throat before redirecting to the shoulder when he sensed Daniel's hesitation. The attacker's scream died abruptly as Daniel pistol-whipped him unconscious. Blood and rain mixed in the churned earth as Daniel collapsed onto his knees, his body screaming in protest. The balaclava came away to reveal another ghost, this one marked by the telltale D9K9 tattoo curling around his neck like a brand. Max's reaction told Daniel everything. The way the dog sniffed the unconscious man before recoiling, his whine carrying decades of unspoken trauma. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. His frantic search of the man's gear yielded no identification, only that damning photograph hidden against the body armor. The image hit him like a bullet to the chest. There stood Max in his prime, alert and proud beside a Delta 9 handler, the same cold-eyed bastard from the SUV. But it was the figure beside them that stopped Daniel's heart. Colonel Elias Voss, his former CO, smiling like a proud father in full-dress uniform. The man who'd personally delivered Max's death notification with tears in his eyes. The man who'd pinned a posthumous medal to Daniel's chest. The world narrowed to that single moment of betrayal. Max's sudden, sharp bark shattered the trance. Too late. The tranquilizer dart took the dog mid-leap, his body going limp before he hit the ground. Daniel barely registered the sting in his own neck before the chemical darkness swallowed him whole. His last conscious sensation was the squelch of polished boots in mud, and that voice, that goddamned familiar voice, issuing orders like they were back on base. Sedate the K-9 fully, package them for transport to Site Bravo. A pause, then quieter. I want him to wake up where it all began. The rain kept falling as unconsciousness claimed them, washing away blood but not sins. Somewhere beyond the trees, a black helicopter's rotors began to spin. Consciousness returned to Daniel in jagged fragments. First, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, then the throbbing ache radiating from his wounded shoulder, and finally the biting cold of concrete beneath his bare skin. He forced his eyes open against the glare of fluorescent lights, his vision swimming into focus on a sterile white ceiling lined with exposed pipes. The air smelled of antiseptic and something darker underneath. Copper, sweat, and the unmistakable musk of frightened animals. He tried to move, but heavy restraints bit into his wrists and ankles, securing him to what appeared to be a medical examination table. The room was windowless, the walls lined with stainless steel cabinets and a large observation mirror that undoubtedly hid watching eyes. To his left, a bank of monitors displayed vital signs, his own, judging by the electrodes stuck to his chest, and another set of readings labeled Subject K9-MX Max. Daniel twisted his head, ignoring the flare of pain from his neck. In an adjacent glass-walled enclosure, Max lay unconscious on a padded table, his shaved flank revealing a latticework of old scars and fresh surgical tape. An IV line ran from his foreleg to a humming dialysis machine, while a collar of blinking electrodes circled his skull. The sight sent white-hot rage through Daniel's veins. "Awake at last, Captain Reynolds." The voice came from behind him, smooth, cultured, and horribly familiar. Footsteps approached, polished shoes clicking against the concrete. Colonel Elias Voss stepped into view, looking every inch the decorated officer in his immaculate uniform, though his eyes held none of their former warmth. He carried a tablet displaying Max's brainwave patterns. "You son of a bitch," Daniel rasped, his throat raw from smoke inhalation. "You told me he was dead." Voss sighed, tapping the tablet. Technically, K9-MX was terminated from active service. The explosion that separated you two caused unfortunate neural damage, or so we thought. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of mint and lies. Imagine my surprise when our behavioral model started flagging shelter intake reports 6 months ago. A German shepherd matching MX's description, showing abnormal aggression patterns. Then you walked into that shelter. A door hissed open, and the cold-eyed man from the SUV entered, now wearing a lab coat over his tactical gear. He injected something into Max's IV line without ceremony. "What are you doing to him?" Daniel strained against the restraints as Max's legs twitched involuntarily. "Stabilizing the implant," the technician said flatly. "Subject's hippocampus is rejecting the latest firmware update." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Implant. Firmware. His eyes darted to the monitors displaying Max's brain activity. The patterns weren't just being monitored, they were being modified, sections lighting up in unnatural synchronization. Voss followed his gaze. "You didn't think we'd invest millions in enhanced military canines without safeguards, did you? Every Delta 9K unit receives a neural lace at implantation, allows for remote obedience conditioning, pain reinforcement, and, if necessary, memory suppression." He swiped the tablet to reveal a grainy video, a younger Max in a training yard, reacting to hand signals no one was giving. MX was always special, the only subject whose implant spontaneously degraded after trauma. We needed to study why. The truth unfolded with terrible clarity. Max hadn't been lost in combat. He'd escaped. Daniel's mind raced through the implications: the shelter, the hit team, the staged explosion at his cabin. This wasn't retrieval. It was a live dissection. Across the room, Max's eyelids fluttered. His nose twitched at Daniel's scent, and suddenly, miraculously, his tail gave a weak thump against the table. Voss didn't miss it. His smile turned icy. Fascinating, the emotional attachment pathways should have been erased during initial reprogramming. He nodded to the technician. "Prepare the wipe sequence. Again, higher voltage this time." The technician hesitated. "Sir, his vitals are already—" "Do it." As the machine powered up with a high-pitched whine, Daniel did the only thing he could. He threw his head back and screamed Max's old activation phrase, the one they'd used for life-or-death situations. "Schutzhund rot." Max's eyes snapped open, pure, gold, fury. The moment the activation phrase left Daniel's lips, the entire lab seemed to freeze. Even the humming machines paused for half a heartbeat, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Max's reaction was instantaneous and terrifying in its precision. His body, which had been limp seconds earlier, convulsed violently against the restraints as every muscle locked into perfect tension. The monitors attached to him exploded with erratic activity, lines spiking into jagged red mountains as his pupils dilated to black pools rimmed with molten gold. A sound tore from his throat that wasn't a growl or a whine, but something far more primal. The battle cry of a predator who just shattered its chains. Voss stumbled back, his polished composure cracking for the first time. "Impossible! The implant should have—" The technician's panicked shout cut him off. "Sir, we're getting full system rejection. His neural lace is—" The rest was drowned out by the shriek of overloading equipment as Max's body arched off the table with impossible strength. The IV needle tore free in a spray of blood, the dialysis machine toppling over with a crash of breaking glass. Electrodes popped like firecrackers as Max's brainwaves spiked beyond the monitor's measurable range. Daniel didn't waste the distraction. He wrenched against his restraints with every ounce of remaining strength, feeling the leather straps bite into his flesh. The metal examination table groaned beneath him, bolts loosening from the floor with each desperate movement. Across the room, Voss had recovered enough to yank a sidearm from his holster, but his hand trembled. Whether from fear or some long-buried guilt, Daniel couldn't tell. "Terminate the subject," Voss barked at the technician. "Full neural scorch before it." The rest of his order died as Max moved. What happened next unfolded faster than human eyes could track. The reinforced straps holding Max snapped like dry twigs as the dog launched himself at the observation mirror. The impact shattered the two-way glass into 1,000 glittering fragments. revealing 3 stunned lab technicians in the monitoring booth beyond. Max hit the ground in a crouch, glass shards raining around him like deadly confetti, then pivoted toward the technician reaching for the emergency kill switch. The man barely had time to scream before Max was on him, not attacking, but strategizing. His jaws closed around the technician's wrist with surgical precision, severing tendons but not arteries. As the man collapsed, Max snatched the keycard dangling from his lanyard and bolted back toward Daniel in a blur of matted fur and raw fury. Voss's gun roared. The bullet grazed Max's flank, painting a crimson streak across his ribs, but the dog didn't falter. He skidded to a stop beside Daniel's table and dropped the keycard onto his chest. Their eyes met, one pair human and stunned, the other canine and blazing with unmistakable intelligence. Daniel's fingers closed around the card just as Voss fired again. This shot went wide, embedding in the wall as Max lunged, not at Voss, but at the main power conduit. His teeth found the vulnerable wiring beneath sterile paneling, and with a shower of sparks, the lights died. Emergency floods kicked in seconds later, bathing the room in hellish red. Daniel had already freed one wrist and was working on the ankle restraints when the door burst open. 2 more guards, rifles raised. Max whirled to face them, his bloody fur standing on end, lips peeled back from teeth that gleamed like ivory daggers in the dim light. Then, from somewhere deeper in the facility, an alarm began to wail. Not the shrill tone of a containment breach, but the deep, pulsing horn of a lockdown. Voss paled. No, the other subjects. Daniel didn't understand. Not until he heard it, the barking. Not from Max. From dozens of other dogs, their cries rising through the ventilation shafts in a chorus of rage and recognition. Somewhere in this nightmare facility, Delta 9 had more K units, and they'd just heard Max's war cry. The guards hesitated, their rifles wavering. Max took one threatening step forward, then another, herding them toward the door with the calculated menace of a wolf cornering prey. Daniel finally wrenched his last restraint free and rolled off the table, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. He grabbed a scalpel from a nearby tray just as the distant barking turned to howling, a sound that raised the hairs on his neck. Voss was already retreating toward a hidden panel in the wall, his voice shaking. "You don't understand what you've unleashed, Reynolds. That implant wasn't just for control, it was containment." Max's ears flicked toward the ventilation ducts. A new sound joined the chaos, the screech of metal giving way, claws on steel, something massive moving through the ducts. Something coming fast. Daniel met Max's eyes and saw the truth there. Whatever was about to burst into this room, his dog recognized it, and it was infinitely more dangerous than armed guards. The ventilation shaft above them tore apart with a metallic scream, its reinforced grating twisting like tissue paper as something enormous and wrong came crashing down into the laboratory. Daniel's combat-honed reflexes barely registered the nightmarish details fast enough. The Rottweiler's distorted frame nearly doubling normal size, its patchy fur stretched like a grotesque canvas over muscles that bulged in anatomically impossible configurations, the way its spine arched too sharply like some terrible fusion of canine and arachnid. The creature's eyes burned with an unnatural amber glow beneath lids that blinked vertically like a reptile's, and when its jaws unhinged to emit a wet, clicking sound, Daniel saw the rows of surgically sharpened teeth that had been grafted into its gums. Most horrifying of all was the pulsating implant at the base of its skull, a throbbing mass of metal and exposed wiring that seemed to breathe independently, casting intermittent crimson shadows across the laboratory walls. Max moved before Daniel could process the full horror, positioning himself between his handler and the monstrosity with his hackles raised. But his posture held nuances only someone who'd fought beside him for years would recognize. The slight tilt of his ears forward rather than flat against his skull, the way his tail gave a single hesitant twitch. This wasn't pure aggression. The mutated Rottweiler responded in kind, its massive head lowering as it emitted a sound that might have been a whine in another life, its glowing eyes locking onto Max with what could only be described as desperate recognition. For one fragile moment, the laboratory hung in suspended animation, two brothers separated by unimaginable cruelty, staring across an abyss of forced mutations and stolen memories. Voss's voice shattered the moment like a gunshot. "They were never just dogs, Captain." The colonel had retreated to a hidden panel in the wall, his palm pressed against a biometric scanner that hissed open to reveal a shadowed escape tunnel. His usual composure had cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath, not of Daniel or Max, but of what he'd created. "We splice-eneered them with tactical predator genomes, hyena pack coordination, wolverine pain resistance, even crocodilian jaw musculature. MX was the only one whose original neural pathways resisted full hybridization." His gaze darted to the convulsing creature as its implant began flashing erratically. "That's K2RT, Max's littermate. They've been trying to reach each other through the ventilation system for months despite isolation protocols." The revelation struck Daniel with physical force, his knees nearly buckling as he stared at the monstrous Rottweiler. No, not a monster, a victim, Max's brother. The way K2 now trembled, its massive head swaying as if fighting some internal battle, the pitiful clicking sounds emerging from its throat between ragged breaths. This was a living creature in unimaginable agony, its very DNA turned against itself. Max responded with a soft whimper that carried decades of shared history, taking a cautious step forward despite the obvious danger, his tail giving the faintest wag, as if trying to remind his brother of their shared puppyhood before the labs, before the implants, before the war. Then the implant flared crimson. The change was instantaneous and horrifying. K2's pained whines morphed into a hair-raising electronic screech that seemed to come from both its throat and the implant itself, its body contorting in unnatural spasms as the device overrode whatever fragile connection had momentarily surfaced. Its glowing eyes refocused on Daniel with single-minded hatred, strings of froth and blood dripping from jaws that now unhinged to their full, terrifying width. Max barely intercepted the lunge, his smaller body slamming against K2's mutated bulk with enough force to send both crashing into a bank of monitoring equipment. Glass shattered in explosive cascades, alarms blared in discordant harmony, and Daniel found himself moving on pure instinct, his fingers closing around a fallen guard's rifle even as blood from his own wounds made the metal slippery. What followed was a battle that defied nature. The two dogs, no, the two brothers, became a blur of teeth and fur and flashing implants. Max fighting not to kill, but to subdue, his movements precise and controlled despite his injuries, while K2's attacks grew increasingly frenzied, its mutated hind legs allowing jumps that carried it halfway up walls before rebounding with terrifying force. The Rottweiler's claws left deep gouges in the concrete floor as it pivoted with unnatural speed, its movements betraying residual combat training beneath the madness, a ghost of the elite military K-unit it had once been. Daniel's breath caught as he recognized the pattern. K2 wasn't attacking randomly. It was herding Max toward the exposed electrical panels along the back wall with chilling tactical awareness. "Max, break left!" Daniel shouted, raising the rifle. The trust between them held even after all these years. Max rolled away without hesitation just as K2 lunged directly into the path of Daniel's controlled 3-round burst. The bullets struck the pulsating implant in a shower of sparks and viscous blue fluid, and K2's shriek became an electronic death rattle that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The creature collapsed mid-leap, its massive body convulsing violently as the damaged implant short-circuited, its limbs twitching in opposing directions as if its nervous system had been severed. The silence that followed was more terrible than the battle. Daniel approached cautiously, his rifle still raised, but his finger off the trigger, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Max was already at his brother's side, sniffing cautiously at the dying creature. As the implant's crimson glow faded, so too did the unnatural amber light in K2's eyes, dimming to a soft, familiar brown that Daniel recognized from countless military working dogs he'd known over the years. The eyes of a good soldier following orders. The eyes of a loyal friend. K2's massive head lifted weakly, its tongue, still normal amidst all the surgical horrors, licking Max's muzzle once in unmistakable forgiveness before its body stilled forever. Daniel's hands shook as he lowered the rifle, the full weight of Voss's crimes settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. This wasn't just illegal experimentation. It was the systematic destruction of living souls, the perversion of the very bond between man and dog that had endured for millennia. His thoughts were interrupted by a new sound rising from deeper within the facility. A chorus of howls answering K2's death cry, some distorted beyond recognition into electronic shrieks, others heartbreakingly pure in their canine anguish. Max returned to Daniel's side, pressing his wet nose into the captain's palm, an unmistakable question hanging between them. The escape route stood open behind them, a clear path to freedom. But from the darkness ahead came the sounds of more victims, more brothers and sisters trapped in cages with their minds and bodies twisted against their will. Daniel looked down at his dog, his partner, his friend, the only being who'd never betrayed him, and saw the answer reflected in those weary but resolute eyes. There would be no leaving, not while even one of their own remained captive in this hell. Daniel racked the rifle's charging handle, the sound echoing through the ruined laboratory like a promise. Together, they moved toward the howling. The corridor beyond the ruined laboratory stretched into darkness, its walls lined with steel containment doors marked with cryptic alphanumeric codes that glowed faintly in the emergency lighting. Each door bore a small reinforced viewport at canine height, and as Daniel moved cautiously forward with Max at his side, he caught glimpses of movement behind the glass, eyes reflecting the dim red lights, some glowing with the same unnatural amber as K2's had, others dark and terrified. The air smelled of antiseptic, blood, and something worse, the sour tang of fear-soaked fur, and the metallic bite of overheating electronics. From behind the doors came a symphony of whimpers, growls, and the occasional heartbreaking sound of a dog's claws scratching feebly at metal. Daniel's grip on the rifle tightened as they passed door after door, each revealing new horrors in brief flashes. A Malinois with its spine visibly augmented by some chrome exoskeleton. A Doberman whose lower jaw had been replaced with a hinged metal apparatus. A German Shepherd puppy no older than 6 months with its skull partially exposed to show pulsing neural implants. Max's reaction to each was subtle but telling. A slight stiffening of his shoulders when they passed certain doors, a barely audible whine at others, as if he recognized former comrades from before the experiments. The deeper they went, the more the facility's true purpose became clear. This wasn't just about creating weapons, it was about breaking and remaking the very essence of what made these creatures dogs. Then the corridor ended abruptly at a massive security door marked Quarantine Protocol, Authorized Personnel Only, in dripping red letters. The biometric scanner beside it was dark, but the door itself stood slightly ajar, as if someone had fled in too much haste to secure it properly. From beyond came sounds that made Max's ears flatten against his skull. Not barks or growls, but something far worse. The wet, clicking noises reminded Daniel of the sounds K2 had made before its implant took over, but multiplied a dozen times over, layered with mechanical whirring, and the occasional burst of static like a radio transmission cutting in and out. Daniel pressed his eye to the gap in the door and felt his blood turn to ice. The chamber beyond was a nightmarish fusion of kennel and operating theater, row upon row of suspended cages holding canine forms in various states of modification, their bodies connected to dangling IV lines and neural monitoring systems. At the room's center stood a massive cylindrical tank filled with glowing blue fluid, inside which floated something that might have once been a Great Dane, but was now more machine than flesh. Its entire skeletal structure replaced with a gleaming metal endoskeleton, its eyes replaced with camera lenses that tracked movement even in its suspended state. Along the far wall, 3 figures in full containment suits worked frantically at a control panel, their voices muffled but urgent. "Can't contain the feedback loop much longer," one was saying, gloved hands flying over holographic displays that showed cascading system failures. The neural network is achieving spontaneous synchronization despite the dampeners. A second scientist shook his head. "It's not synchronization, it's communication. The alpha cluster is using the implants to bypass our firewalls. They're talking to each other." The third figure, taller than the others, with the bearing of someone in charge, turned slightly, and Daniel caught a glimpse of Voss's profile through the faceplate. "Then purge the entire cluster," the colonel snapped. "Initiate protocol final howl before—" A sound cut him off. A single, pure howl that rose from somewhere deep in the facility, untouched by mechanical distortion. Max's head jerked up at the sound, his entire body going rigid. Daniel recognized that reaction. It was the same way Max had responded to certain whistle commands during their service, but this wasn't a human sound, it was canine. And as the howl continued, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the captive dogs in their cages began to answer. First, a normal bark from behind them in the corridor. Then, a distorted electronic yowl from a cage nearby. Then, a chorus of responses, some natural, some horrifically altered, until the very walls seemed to vibrate with the sound. On the control panels, every monitor began flashing the same error message: neural network integrity compromised. Voss spun toward the door where Daniel and Max stood hidden. "They're here," he breathed. Then louder, to the others, "Lock down the—" The explosion came from above. The ceiling of the quarantine chamber burst open in a rain of concrete and twisted metal as 5 massive shapes dropped through, canine in base form but so heavily modified they barely qualified as animals anymore. One landed directly atop a scientist, its hydraulic-enhanced jaws making short work of the containment suit. Another tore into the control panels with claws that sparked against the electronics. The largest, a creature that might have been part wolf, part machine, went straight for Voss, driving him back against the central tank with terrifying precision. But most chilling of all was how they moved. Not as mindless beasts, but with clear tactical coordination. Flanking maneuvers, covering fire, hand signals. They were using military tactics. Max let out a soft whine, his body trembling against Daniel's leg. Not from fear, Daniel realized, from recognition. These weren't just experiments. They were Delta 9's first-generation K-units, the original prototypes. And they'd come for their creator. The quarantine chamber descended into chaos as the first-generation K units systematically dismantled Voss's control over the facility, their movements displaying a chilling blend of animal instinct and military precision that surpassed even Max's capabilities. Daniel pressed himself against the wall just outside the doorframe, his fingers digging into Max's scruff to keep the dog from charging into the fray, his own breath coming in ragged gasps as he took in the nightmarish ballet unfolding before them. The largest prototype, designated Alpha 1, according to the broken holographic display, had Voss pinned against the central tank with one massive paw, its hybridized muzzle split open to reveal not teeth but rotating bone saws that whirred inches from the colonel's face. What chilled Daniel to the core wasn't the violence, but the way Alpha 1's glowing blue eyes tracked Voss's terrified expression with what could only be described as cold, calculating satisfaction. This wasn't mindless aggression. This was retribution. From the dangling cages around the room, the other captive dogs had begun a cacophony of barks and howls that synchronized unnaturally, creating an almost rhythmic pattern that made the remaining lights flicker in time. The two surviving scientists cowered near a shattered control panel, their containment suits torn and leaking oxygen as they watched the prototypes herd them toward an empty containment cell with terrifying efficiency. One tried to activate an emergency beacon on his wrist, only for a smaller prototype, its body more machine than flesh, with exposed hydraulic tendons snapping with each movement, to sever his hand at the wrist with a single precise bite. The detached hand hit the floor still clutching the beacon, its distress signal flashing uselessly against the pooling blood. Max trembled against Daniel's leg, not with fear, but with something far more complex: recognition, longing, even guilt. Daniel risked a glance down and saw his dog's eyes locked onto Alpha 1 with an intensity that bordered on reverence. The pieces clicked together with sudden, terrifying clarity. These first-generation prototypes weren't just escaped experiments. They were the original Delta 9 K-Unit team, Max's former pack, and they'd come to finish what the explosion years ago had interrupted. A guttural, static-laced growl from Alpha 1 cut through the chaos, and for one impossible second, Daniel could have sworn the sound formed actual words buried in the distortion, something that sounded like remember and mission. Voss must have heard it too, because his ashen face went somehow paler. You weren't supposed to retain language capacity," he choked out, struggling against the paw crushing his chest. "The neural dampers were—" Alpha 1's response was to lean closer, the whirring bone saws pausing just long enough for the prototype to emit a series of electronic pulses that made the remaining monitors explode with garbled text. Text that resolved for one brief moment into a looping command. Terminate Project Overseer. Initiate Pack Recovery Protocol. Then the lights died completely. In the pitch black, the room erupted into movement too fast to follow. The sound of tearing metal, shattering glass, and Voss's abruptly cut-off scream blending into a horrific symphony. Daniel dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max as something massive rushed past them in the dark, its hot breath gusting over them like a desert wind before moving on. For one endless minute, there was nothing but the sounds of destruction and the occasional flash of sparks from ruined equipment. When the emergency lights finally flickered back on, the quarantine chamber was transformed. The central tank lay in pieces, its fluid draining through cracks in the floor. The cages hung open and empty. Of Voss and the scientists, there was no sign beyond a single discarded boot and the smeared trail leading to the ventilation shafts. Alpha 1 stood waiting at the far door, its glowing eyes fixed on Max. Slowly, deliberately, it jerked its head toward the exit, an unmistakable command. Max whined deep in his throat, looking up at Daniel with eyes full of conflicted loyalty. The message was clear. The prototypes were leaving, and they expected Max to join them, to rejoin his pack. From the corridor behind them came new sounds, shouting voices, the clatter of approaching security forces. The facility was mobilizing. Alpha 1 growled low in its throat, the sound resolving for one eerie moment into something almost linguistic. Now. Daniel looked down at Max, his hands shaking. This wasn't just a choice between escape and capture. It was a choice between the man who loved him and the pack that remembered him, between a life of hiding and whatever war the prototypes were planning. Max licked Daniel's wrist once, a fleeting touch of goodbye, then turned toward Alpha 1. Daniel's heart shattered, but then Max stopped, looked back, and did something extraordinary. He barked, not at Daniel, not at Alpha 1, at the empty cages. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, from the ruined ventilation shafts, the shadows began to move. Dozens of eyes gleamed in the dark as the second-generation hybrids, the ones deemed failures, the ones left behind, emerged from their hiding places. Some limped, some dragged useless mechanical limbs. All looked to Max with desperate hope. Alpha 1 let out a sound that might have been frustration, might have been respect. It gave Max one last, long look, then turned and vanished into the darkness, the other prototypes following. The message was clear. They'd chosen different paths. The approaching footsteps grew louder. Daniel scooped up a fallen access card and turned to Max's ragtag army of rejects. "You all want out of here?" The responding chorus of barks, yips, and electronic warbles left no doubt. Daniel cracked the door open just as the first security team rounded the corner. "Then let's show them why they should have treated you better." The first stun grenade went off with a beautiful, blinding light. The corridor erupted into chaos as Max's ragtag army of modified dogs surged forward with a symphony of barks, electronic, warbles, and the screech of metal claws on concrete. Daniel moved like a man possessed, his military instincts merging seamlessly with Max's tactical signals, a flick of the ears here, a sharp yip there, directing their unlikely battalion with precision that belied their lack of formal training together. The security team never stood a chance. A Malinois with reinforced titanium jaws clamped down on the barrel of the first guard's rifle, twisting it into useless scrap while a Doberman with hyperextending hind legs launched itself at the second guard's chest, knocking him into his comrades like a furry missile. The smaller hybrids, the ones deemed failures by Voss's standards, proved most terrifying of all, their unpredictable modifications making their movements impossible to anticipate. One terrier mix with exposed spinal circuitry scampered up the walls to drop onto shoulders from above, while a Rottweiler pup, no bigger than a football, emitted high-frequency pulses that made the guards' stun batons overload in their hands. Daniel and Max carved a path through the facility's underbelly, their ragtag army growing with each containment zone they liberated. Dogs of every size and modification joined the exodus, some dragging IV poles still attached to their veins, others limping on half-mechanical limbs, all united by the same desperate need for freedom. The alarms wailed like dying animals, the strobe lights casting jerky shadows of their rebellion across blood-smeared walls. At every junction, Daniel expected to meet lethal resistance, but the facility's defenses had been mysteriously disabled. Blast doors left half open, security systems powered down, as if Alpha 1's pack had paved their escape route before vanishing into the night. They burst into the final antechamber, a loading dock littered with abandoned crates marked with the Delta 9 insignia. Moonlight streamed through the open bay doors, painting silver trails across the oil-stained concrete. Beyond lay the forest, dark and endless and free. The dogs didn't need encouragement. They bolted for the tree line in a wave of wagging tails and joyful yips, their injuries forgotten in the euphoria of escape. Only Max hesitated, lingering at Daniel's side as they watched the others disappear into the wilderness where they'd have to learn to be dogs again, despite all that had been done to them. Daniel knelt in the pool of moonlight, his hands finding Max's face, his thumbs brushing the scars around his implant. "You could have gone with them," he whispered, "with your real pack." Max responded by pressing his forehead against Daniel's, his breath warm and familiar, his eyes holding all the words his vocal cords couldn't form. In that silence, Daniel understood. There are bonds no experiment can break, no implant can overwrite. Some loyalties run deeper than programming, deeper than DNA. A distant howl echoed through the trees. Alpha 1's call, clear and commanding. Max's ears twitched, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he licked Daniel's cheek once, decisively, then nudged him toward the waiting forest. They ran together into the moonlight, side by side as they'd always been, leaving behind the ghosts of what they'd lost and carrying forward the unshakable truth of what they'd found. Moral lesson: true loyalty cannot be engineered or erased. It blooms in the darkest corners of experimentation, survives the cruelest tests of betrayal, and proves that even in a world that seeks to mechanize the soul, some bonds remain beautifully, defiantly alive. The purest hearts remember their way home, not through circuits or codes, but through love that outlasts even the deepest scars.